What if the thing breaking your heart is not that they do not love you enough, but that you keep trying to earn what should never have required begging in the first place? Sit with that for a second, because sometimes the deepest pain is not rejection. It is what you do to yourself while trying to avoid rejection. The extra message, the extra explanation, the waiting, the hoping, the lowering of your standards, just to keep a connection alive that keeps asking you to shrink. And the cruel part is that it rarely feels desperate while you are inside it. It feels like patience. It feels like understanding. It feels like fighting for love. But little by little, something else is happening. You're no longer just wanting affection. You're negotiating your dignity for small pieces of it. That is where everything starts to go wrong. This is not about becoming cold. It is not about pretending you do not care. It is not about turning love into pride. It is about seeing clearly. It is about returning to self-respect before your heart gets so used to crumbs that it forgets what real affection feels like. Because the moment you stop begging, something changes inside you first. Your mind gets quieter. Your vision gets sharper. Behavior starts telling the truth that words kept hiding. And for the first time in a long time, you stop asking someone else to confirm that you matter. That is when your life begins to recalibrate. Not because they change, because you do. And the first truth you have to face is this. You are not only asking for love, you are asking for proof. You're not asking for love, you're asking for proof. This is one of the hardest things to admit, because on the surface, it looks like love. It looks like missing them, wanting closeness, wanting reassurance, wanting to feel chosen. But if you look a little deeper, what hurts so much is often not the absence of romance itself. It is the desperate need for proof. Proof that you matter. Proof that you are not being forgotten. Proof that you are still wanted, still valuable, still enough. That is why it feels so exhausting. You are not just hoping for affection. You are waiting for a message to calm your nervous system. You are waiting for consistency to silence your doubts. You are waiting for someone else's attention to settle questions that should never have been placed in their hands to answer. And that changes the whole emotional structure of the connection. Because now love is no longer being received freely. It is being used to hold together parts of you that feel shaky. Their warmth becomes relief. Their silence becomes danger. Their interest becomes proof that you are safe, worthy, and still significant. That is too much weight to place on another person. And it explains why the whole thing starts feeling heavier than it should. You are not only dealing with the relationship, you are dealing with what the relationship has come to represent. Safety, worth, emotional certainty. A kind of inner stability you may not yet feel strongly enough on your own. That is why a small shift in their energy can affect you so much. It is not only about them pulling away, it is about what their distance seems to say. And once the mind starts hearing distance as a message about your value, the need for affection becomes almost unbearable. This is where clarity matters. Because once you see that you are asking for proof more than love, you stop romanticizing the pain. You stop calling every anxious attachment a deep connection. You start realizing that part of what you are chasing is emotional confirmation, not just intimacy. That realization can hurt, but it also frees you. It brings you back to a more honest question. What part of me still needs another person to prove that I matter? That is the real work. Not how to make them reassure you more, but how to stop placing your worth inside their behavior. Because no matter how much affection they give, it will never be enough if the deeper wound is still untouched. You will always need one more sign, one more message, one more moment of reassurance. The hunger will keep returning because the real problem was never only the relationship. It was the fragile place inside you that kept asking someone else to confirm your value. And this is where the shift begins. The moment you stop asking another person to prove that you are worthy of love is the moment you begin becoming much harder to emotionally control. You still care, you still feel, you still want real affection, but now you are no longer using someone else's behavior as the final vote on your worth. That changes everything. Begging trains people to give you the bare minimum. This part is painful because it means your desperation is not only hurting you, it is also teaching the other person how little they can give and still keep you there. That is the real cost. If your presence stays available no matter what, if you keep explaining, waiting, forgiving, and reopening the door before anything truly changes, then the connection starts teaching a very dangerous lesson. It teaches them that inconsistency has no real price, that delay is acceptable, that silence can be excused, that effort can stay weak and access will still remain open. And once that pattern settles in, the relationship changes. Not always with cruelty, not always with bad intentions. Sometimes it happens simply because people adjust to what your behavior allows. If they learn that you will keep offering emotional access even when they show up halfway, then halfway slowly becomes normal. The bare minimum starts looking sufficient because nothing in the structure of the connection forces anything better. That is why begging lowers the standard without announcing it. You may think you are fighting for love, but what you are actually doing is removing the urgency for the other person to rise. You keep filling the gap yourself. You keep supplying the patience, the understanding, the emotional labor, the extra effort, the extra softness. So the imbalance stays alive, because you keep carrying the weight that should have exposed it. And this is where self-respect starts bleeding quietly. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in small moments, the second message after no reply. The excuse you already know is weak, but accept anyway. The conversation where you ask for the same basic care again, hoping this time it will finally land. Every time that happens, the connection learns something. It learns that your boundaries are emotional, not structural. That your pain may be real, but your access is still easy to keep. That is what keeps the cycle going. A healthy connection does not need you to beg in order to receive what should already be natural. Attention, consistency, consideration, effort. These things should not have to be dragged out of someone through repeated explanations and emotional exhaustion. The moment they do, you are already paying too much. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You stop asking only, why are they giving me so little? You begin asking a harder question. What have my actions been teaching them about what I will tolerate? That question gives your power back, because now the problem is no longer only their behavior. It is also the pattern that kept rewarding that behavior with continued access to you. That pattern can be broken. But it is not broken through speeches alone. It is broken when your availability stops being automatic, when your standards stop being requests and start becoming reality, when your energy is no longer handed over to someone who keeps proving they only show up when it costs them very little. That is where this truth leads. Begging does not inspire deeper love. It often trains weaker effort, and the moment you stop helping someone get used to giving you crumbs is the moment the connection starts revealing what it actually is. The hidden cost is your daily self-respect. What makes this so dangerous is that it usually does not destroy your self-respect all at once. It wears it down quietly. A small compromise here, a little extra patience there. One more excuse accepted. One more moment where you pretend not to notice what is obvious because facing it would hurt more than delaying it. And because each moment looks small by itself, it becomes easy to call it maturity, compassion, or understanding. But deep down, you feel it. You feel the part of you that knows this is costing too much. You feel the tension that appears when your mouth says, it's okay, but your nervous system knows it is not okay. You feel that private disappointment in yourself after you once again accepted less than what your heart had already admitted was not enough. That is the hidden cost. It is not only that the other person gives less, it is that you slowly begin trusting yourself less. Because every time you betray what you already know, something inside you weakens. Your standards stop feeling solid. Your boundaries start sounding negotiable even to you. And after a while, the pain is not only coming from them, it is coming from the growing distance between your behavior and your truth. That distance is exhausting. It makes you feel split. One part of you sees clearly. Another part keeps staying, explaining, hoping, and making room for what keeps hurting you. And the longer that split continues, the harder it becomes to feel clean inside yourself. Not because you are weak, but because self-respect cannot grow in a place where your own clarity keeps getting overridden. This is why the damage feels so personal. You are not only tired of what they are doing, you are tired of what you keep agreeing to in order to keep the connection alive. That is a painful realization, but it is also an important one because it brings the focus back to where change can actually begin. Not with another conversation about your needs, not with one more attempt to make them understand. With you. With the moment you decide that your self-respect can no longer be the thing sacrificed every time affection becomes uncertain. Because love should not require you to keep abandoning yourself in small, polite ways. It should not ask you to become softer with your standards and harsher with your own heart. It should not leave you constantly explaining away behavior that your dignity already recognized as wrong. Once you really see that, begging becomes harder to continue. Not because the longing disappears overnight, but because the cost becomes too visible to ignore. You begin noticing what each compromise is doing to you. You begin feeling how much energy it takes to keep calling disrespect, confusion, inconsistency, a rough time, and emotional starvation something worth waiting through. And that awareness changes things, because the moment your self-respect starts mattering more than the fantasy of finally being chosen, the whole structure begins to crack. You stop asking, "How do I keep this?" and start asking, "Why am I paying with my dignity just to remain in it?" That question is not the end of love, it is the beginning of waking up. Chasing creates an addiction loop, not a bond. This is where things get even more painful, because what feels like attachment is often not closeness at all. It is a loop. A message comes, and your whole body relaxes. Then silence returns, and the anxiety comes back with it. A small moment of warmth makes you hopeful again. Then distance appears, and suddenly you are searching for signs, replaying words, waiting for the next drop of affection that might calm you down. That pattern can feel intense, but intensity is not the same thing as connection. It is often a cycle of deprivation and relief. That is why chasing becomes addictive so quickly. You are not being nourished steadily, you are being kept emotionally alert. The attention comes in flashes, and because it is inconsistent, your mind starts treating it like something precious. Not because it is truly deep, but because it is unstable. You begin craving the next moment of closeness, the way a thirsty person craves water, even if what you are getting is barely enough to keep the hope alive. That is not a bond. That is dependency wrapped in anticipation. And this is what makes it so hard to leave. If the person were cold all the time, clarity would come faster. If they were absent all the time, your heart would eventually stop negotiating. But when affection appears just enough to restart hope, the mind keeps saying, maybe now, maybe this time, maybe I just need to be more patient. That is how the loop survives. It keeps feeding you just enough to stop you from walking away. The problem is that your nervous system starts confusing emotional instability with emotional depth. The highs feel meaningful because the lows hurt so much. The relief feels like love because the hunger became so intense. But what you are feeling is often not security, not peace, not mutual care. It is the emotional swing between absence and temporary relief. That swing can become powerful. You begin living for the next sign, the next reply, the next good moment, the next small gesture that tells you not to give up yet. And while all of that is happening, your life starts shrinking around a cycle that keeps you emotionally occupied but never truly held. That is why this truth matters so much. You have to ask yourself whether you are actually being loved or whether you are being kept attached through inconsistency. Those are not the same thing. One gives you peace, the other gives you spikes. One deepens your life, the other keeps you emotionally circling the same hunger. Once you see that clearly, the whole connection starts looking different. You stop calling chaos chemistry. You stop calling anxiety passion. You stop calling emotional withdrawal something romantic just because the return feels so intense. You begin seeing the pattern for what it is, a loop that keeps your hope alive while draining your stability. That is not what love is supposed to do. Love can challenge you. It can humble you. It can ask you to grow, but it should not keep you addicted to uncertainty. It should not train your heart to survive on inconsistency and call that devotion. So this fourth truth asks for honesty. If the connection keeps surviving on hot and cold attention, what is growing there is not trust. It is craving. And craving can hold you for a long time if you keep mistaking it for a bond. The moment you stop romanticizing the loop is the moment you begin loosening its hold on you. You confuse attachment with a need to be chosen. This is where the whole thing becomes even more personal, because sometimes you are not only attached to the person, you are attached to what being chosen by that person would seem to mean about you. That is why letting go feels so hard. It is not only that you want them, it is that some part of you has started believing that if they finally love you properly, stay properly, show up properly, then something inside you will finally settle. You will feel confirmed, enough, significant, safe, as if their choice could close a wound that has been open for much longer than the relationship itself. That is a heavy burden to place on another human being, and it changes the entire emotional meaning of the connection. You stop relating to them only as a person. They become a symbol, a test, a verdict, a chance to prove that you are worth staying for, worth fighting for, worth loving without hesitation. Once that happens, attachment becomes much harder to untangle, because now you are not just trying to keep someone, you are trying to protect an idea. The idea that winning their love would finally silence the old fear that you are somehow not enough unless somebody chooses you fully. That fear can run very deep. It can make you chase longer than you should. It can make you tolerate mixed signals, weak effort, and emotional confusion, because the heart is no longer asking only, "Do I love them?" It is asking something much more vulnerable. What does it say about me if I am not chosen? That is the real pain underneath a lot of desperate attachment. And until you face that, the cycle keeps repeating. Because even if this person disappeared completely, the deeper wound would still be waiting. The need to be chosen would simply look for a new face, a new story, a new connection to carry the same emotional hunger. That is why this truth matters. You have to start separating love from self-verification. You have to stop asking another person to decide whether you are enough. Their confusion does not define your value. Their inconsistency does not measure your lovability. Their inability to meet you fully does not reduce what you are. But if you keep treating their choice like the final judgment, your peace will keep hanging in the air, waiting for someone else to bring it down. This is where self-respect begins to return. You start asking a different question, not, "How do I get them to choose me?" but, "Why have I tied so much of my worth to whether they do?" That question goes deeper. It stops the performance. It stops the chase from pretending to be romance when part of it is really pain asking for proof. And once you see that clearly, something changes. You stop putting them above you in your own mind. You stop acting as if their love would crown you with value you do not already possess. You begin understanding that being chosen is beautiful when it is mutual and healthy, but it cannot be the place where your identity is built. That foundation has to be yours. Otherwise, every relationship becomes a courtroom, and every distance becomes a sentence. So this fifth truth asks you to be honest about what you are really fighting for. Is it the person or the meaning you attach to being chosen by them? Is it love or the hope that their affection will finally heal an older insecurity? Because the moment you stop confusing attachment with the need to be chosen, the whole connection becomes easier to read. And what once felt like destiny starts looking much more clearly like a wound asking to be healed in the right place. Your silence isn't punishment, it's self-rescue. This is important because when you pull back, your mind may immediately accuse you of becoming cold. It may tell you that you are being dramatic, immature, unfair, or manipulative. It may whisper that if you stop reaching, stop explaining, stop checking, stop offering the same emotional energy to someone who keeps giving less, then you are somehow doing something cruel. But that is not what is happening. Sometimes silence is not a game. It is recovery. It is what happens when you finally realize you cannot keep pouring your emotional energy into a connection that keeps giving you confusion in return. It is what happens when your nervous system is tired of begging for clarity, tired of chasing reassurance, tired of surviving on mixed signals and calling that patience. That kind of silence is not punishment. It is the moment you stop bleeding. Because as long as you stay fully available inside an uneven connection, you keep losing something: attention, calm, dignity, emotional strength. You keep handing over access while receiving very little that actually restores you. Pulling back interrupts that leak. It gives your mind space to breathe and your heart space to hear itself again. That is why this matters so much. Without distance, everything stays blurred. You keep reacting, explaining, hoping, and interpreting. You stay so close to the emotional turbulence that you cannot see the shape of the truth anymore. Silence creates room, and room changes what becomes visible. Suddenly the pattern gets louder, their inconsistency gets louder, your exhaustion gets louder. The imbalance you kept softening with words becomes much harder to ignore once you stop filling the silence with your own effort. This is where self-rescue begins, not with anger, not with revenge, with refusal. Refusal to keep overextending yourself. Refusal to keep translating disrespect into "they're just confused." Refusal to keep giving more access than the connection has earned. That is not cruelty, that is self-protection. And yes, it can feel uncomfortable at first. When you stop reaching, the empty space becomes real. You notice how much energy you were spending. You notice how often you were the one keeping the emotional current alive. You notice how quiet things become when you stop carrying both sides of the connection. That realization can hurt, but it also clears the fog. Because once you stop talking over reality, reality gets easier to hear. So if you are pulling back, do not rush to call yourself harsh. Look more carefully. Maybe you are not punishing anyone. Maybe you are finally choosing not to abandon yourself any longer. Maybe your silence is the first honest thing you have done in a long time. And sometimes that is exactly what saves you. When you stop explaining, reality gets loud. As long as you keep explaining for them, the truth stays blurred. You explain their inconsistency. You explain the delay. You explain the silence. You explain why they are distant, why they are confused, why they are overwhelmed, why things are not as clear as they should be. And while you're doing all of that, something very important gets covered up: their behavior. That is why stopping the explanations changes so much. Because the moment you stop filling every gap with your own interpretation, reality starts speaking for itself. You no longer have your words softening what their actions are already saying. You no longer keep turning obvious patterns into temporary misunderstandings. You no longer keep protecting the connection from the truth of what it actually feels like to be inside it. And once that noise drops, the pattern gets loud. Consistency becomes obvious, or the lack of it does. Effort becomes obvious, or the lack of it does. Care becomes obvious, or the lack of it does. You stop living in a cloud of possibilities and start seeing the structure of the relationship as it really is. That can feel shocking at first. Not because the truth was never there, but because your explanations were buffering you from it. They gave you something to hold on to, a softer version of reality, a more hopeful interpretation, a reason to stay a little longer. But hope built on explanation is fragile because it keeps asking you to ignore what your own nervous system has already been trying to tell you. This is why silence is so clarifying. The less you explain, the less room there is for illusion. The less you chase, the easier it becomes to see what comes toward you on its own. The less you keep rescuing the image of the connection, the more clearly you can tell whether there is anything solid underneath it. That is not negativity. That is honesty. And honesty changes the emotional atmosphere immediately. You stop asking, what could this mean if I look at it in the kindest possible way? You start asking, what is this actually showing me? That question is stronger, cleaner too. It brings you back to facts instead of fantasies, and facts are often much calmer than the stories you keep building around them. Because when you stop explaining, you finally hear the difference between words and behavior. One may sound loving, the other tells the truth. And once you begin trusting what is actually being shown, instead of what you keep trying to rescue with interpretation, your self-respect starts returning. You stop carrying the emotional burden of making everything look better than it is. You stop helping the connection hide from itself. That is where clarity begins, not in one dramatic revelation, but in the quiet moment when you stop speaking over reality and let it be heard. Healthy affection doesn't require a closing argument. There is something deeply exhausting about having to keep making the case for how you should be treated, explaining why consistency matters, explaining why respect matters, explaining why basic care should not feel rare, explaining why your needs are not too much, why your pain is not an overreaction, why affection should not have to be dragged out through long emotional speeches. After a while, that does something to you. You stop feeling loved and start feeling like a lawyer for your own humanity. That is the sign that something is off. Because healthy affection does not need a closing argument. It does not need endless persuasion. It does not need you to keep building perfect emotional presentations just to receive what should already come naturally in a connection that is real. Care, effort, consideration. These things should not appear only after you have exhausted yourself explaining why they matter. The moment that becomes normal, the price is already too high. And this is not about expecting perfection. People can misunderstand. They can have blind spots. They can need a conversation. That part is human. But there is a difference between one honest conversation and a relationship where you keep having to convince someone to do what love would have made obvious. That difference matters. Because when affection is healthy, you do not have to keep translating your pain into more digestible language so the other person might finally treat you well. You do not have to keep reducing your needs into little acceptable pieces just so they will not feel burdened by them. You do not have to become endlessly reasonable just to receive basic emotional dignity. That is not love becoming difficult. That is you paying too much to stay in it. And the more that happens, the more your spirit starts tiring. Not only because you are not getting enough, but because you are being forced into a role that should never have become yours. You are no longer simply relating. You are persuading, managing, justifying, presenting evidence for why your heart deserves what it should never have had to beg for. That is where clarity begins to return. You start seeing that if someone needs constant convincing in order to treat you right, then the problem is no longer only communication. The problem is capacity, readiness, willingness. The problem is that the relationship is asking you to fight for what should already be part of its structure. And that kind of fight drains love very quickly. Because affection should feel like a place where your heart can rest, not a courtroom where it must keep arguing for basic fairness. So this truth asks you to notice something simple but very revealing. How much of your energy is going into trying to make someone understand what decent care should already have shown them? How often are you giving speeches where mutual effort should have been speaking for itself? That answer tells you a lot. Because the moment you stop trying to convince someone to love you properly is often the moment you start seeing the connection more honestly. And once you see it honestly, you stop confusing emotional labor with intimacy. That is when your standards begin to rise again. Boundaries only work when they become actions. A boundary is not real just because you explained it beautifully. It becomes real when your behavior changes. That is the part many people avoid, because words are easier than consequences. It feels strong to say, "I deserve better," or "I can't keep doing this," or "If this continues, I'll have to step back." But if nothing actually changes after those words, then the relationship learns something very quickly. It learns that your boundary is emotional, not structural. That means the line exists in your heart, but not in the pattern of your behavior. You still answer the same way. You still stay available the same way. You still keep giving access, attention, patience, and explanation without requiring anything different in return. And once that happens, the boundary loses its force. Not because your pain is not real, because your actions kept teaching the opposite of what your words were trying to say. That is why action matters so much here. A real boundary changes access. It changes availability. It changes what you continue participating in and what you no longer make room for. It says, without needing a speech every time, "This is what I will no longer keep helping happen." That is when people start understanding you differently. Not when you become louder, when you become harder to ignore through consistency. This can be uncomfortable because action removes the illusion that your boundary was only a conversation. Now it becomes a choice. Now it becomes a standard with shape. You do not keep repeating yourself endlessly. You let your behavior carry the message. That is what protects your self-respect. Otherwise, boundaries become another place where you exhaust yourself. You explain, they apologize, you soften, the pattern returns, and then you explain again. After a while, the cycle itself becomes part of the problem. Not because you were wrong to speak, but because speaking was never followed by enough change to make the boundary real. This is where honesty matters. If you say, "You will step back," step back. If you say you need consistency, stop rewarding inconsistency with the same access. If you say something is no longer acceptable, then let your choices reflect that truth. That is not harshness. That is alignment. And alignment changes everything, because once your actions begin matching your standards, your energy becomes clearer. You stop sending mixed signals. You stop telling the other person, "This hurts me deeply," while still behaving in a way that says, "Nothing really has to change." That mixed message is what keeps many painful connections alive. So this truth is simple, but it cuts deep. Boundaries are not measured by how strongly you feel them. They are measured by what they change. The real power of a boundary is not in the sentence. It is in the behavior that follows it. And the moment your boundaries become actions, the whole relationship starts revealing itself much faster. Stop being the relationship's therapist. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes from always being the one holding everything together. You are the one calming the tension, translating the silence, carrying the hard conversations, making sense of their moods, softening every conflict, and doing the emotional work that keeps the connection from collapsing. After a while, it can start feeling noble, deep, mature. But if you look closely, something is off. You are not being met, you are managing. That is a very different role. Love is not supposed to feel like you are running emotional maintenance on the relationship by yourself. It is not supposed to feel like your job is to keep interpreting their behavior in the kindest possible way, repairing every rupture, and carrying all the emotional weight while they simply benefit from your patience. That is not partnership. That is unpaid emotional labor. And the more you live inside that role, the easier it becomes to confuse usefulness with love. You start thinking that because you understand them so deeply, help them so much, and keep the connection alive through sheer emotional effort, something meaningful must be happening. Something is happening, yes, but it may not be love. It may be dependence on your ability to absorb what they refuse to handle themselves. That is why this truth matters so much. If you are always the one regulating the entire connection, then your energy is not being cherished. It is being used. Maybe not always maliciously, maybe not even consciously, but used all the same. And that leaves a mark on you. You get tired in ways that are hard to explain. You stop feeling held. You stop feeling relaxed inside the connection. You become hyper-aware, emotionally responsible for too much, and privately resentful because the depth you keep bringing is not being matched. You are carrying the relationship's inner life while the other person keeps showing up lighter because you keep absorbing the weight. That is too much. This does not mean care should be equal in a mechanical way every single day. Real relationships move through seasons. One person may need more support at certain times. That is human. But when one side becomes the permanent therapist, regulator, translator, and emotional container, the connection stops being balanced. One person is loving, the other is leaning. You have to notice that, because once you do, you stop asking only whether they need you. You begin asking whether they truly know how to love you without constantly needing to be managed. That question changes everything. A healthy relationship may include comfort, support, and emotional depth, but it does not require you to become the full-time stabilizer of another adult's inner world. You are not there to mother the inconsistency, coach the maturity, or endlessly process what they should already be willing to face themselves. That is where your self-respect comes back in. You can care deeply without becoming the relationship's emotional engine. You can be compassionate without making their growth your responsibility. You can listen without carrying. You can support without rescuing. And once you stop confusing emotional overfunctioning with love, the whole structure becomes easier to see. Then a harder question appears. If I stop managing everything, what remains? That question tells the truth. Because if the whole connection depends on your ability to keep repairing, soothing, explaining, and carrying, then what you have is not mutual love. It is one person doing emotional architecture while the other keeps living inside the shelter. And that is not a place where your heart can rest. Watch what they do after you pull back. This is where the fog starts clearing. As long as you are the one reaching, explaining, checking in, softening the distance, and keeping the emotional door open, it is very hard to know what is truly coming from them. Your energy fills so much of the space that their real level of effort stays hidden inside your effort. That is why pulling back matters, not as a trick, not as a performance, not to provoke a reaction and feel powerful for a moment. It matters because once you stop carrying the connection, you finally get to see what walks on its own, and that tells you more than words ever will, because words usually show up fast. The apology can come fast. The promise can come fast. The sudden warmth, the sudden interest, the sudden "I miss you," the sudden emotional speech about how much you matter. All of that can arrive quickly, especially when someone feels your energy pulling away. But genuine effort moves differently. It does not only react to your absence, it begins changing behavior. it becomes more consistent, more respectful, more intentional. It does not ask you to return immediately just because a few emotional words were spoken. It starts building something steadier than urgency. That is the difference you need to watch. Anyone can panic when access changes. Anyone can say the right things when they feel the distance. But not everyone is willing to do the slower work of showing up differently over time. That is where the truth lives. Not in the emotional spike after you pull back, but in what remains after the first reaction fades. So, pay attention carefully. Do they only reach when they feel you slipping away, then go quiet again once they feel safe? Do they make promises that sound deep but never become structure? Do they respond to the loss of access, but not to the deeper issue that created the distance in the first place? Those things matter. Because if the effort only appears when they fear losing you, then what you are seeing may not be love maturing. It may just be comfort reacting to the possibility of losing what it had grown used to. That is not the same thing as someone truly rising to meet you. Real effort has patience in it. It has consistency in it. It has follow-through in it. It does not only speak when the room gets emotionally intense, it keeps telling the truth after the intensity passes. That is why this truth is so useful. It teaches you not to be hypnotized by immediate emotion. It teaches you to stop reading urgency as proof of depth. It reminds you that the real question is not, did they say something when I pulled back? The real question is, what changed in the pattern after I stopped making it easy for them to stay the same? That question protects you, because once you start watching behavior instead of reacting to words, your vision gets much sharper. You stop getting pulled around by every emotional moment. You begin seeing whether the connection is actually trying to become healthier or whether it is only trying to restore your availability without earning it differently. And that is where the truth finally gets hard to ignore. Your standards rise the moment you return to yourself. There is a strange shift that happens once you step back long enough to feel your own peace again. At first, the silence can feel empty. The space can feel uncomfortable. You may even miss the intensity, the constant checking, the small emotional highs that used to keep you attached. But then something begins to settle. Your mind gets quieter. Your body stops bracing all the time. You start noticing how much energy you were spending just trying to survive on very little. And once you feel that clearly, something else happens. What once looked romantic starts looking insulting. The crumbs that used to keep you hopeful no longer feel sweet. The inconsistency that once felt mysterious no longer feels deep. The bare minimum that once seemed worth waiting for starts looking exactly like what it is. Too little, too unstable, too expensive for what it keeps costing your peace. That is what happens when you return to yourself. Your standards rise naturally, not because you are trying to become harsh, not because you are forcing yourself to reject what you still care about. They rise because your nervous system finally remembers what it feels like not to live in constant emotional hunger. And once you remember peace, chaos loses some of its charm. That changes your whole perspective. You stop asking, how can I make this work? You start asking, why did I ever think this was enough? That is a powerful question, because it shows that your value is no longer being negotiated inside the connection. You are no longer measuring your worth by how much affection you can extract from someone who keeps giving too little. You are measuring the connection against your peace, your dignity, and the clarity you are beginning to rebuild. That is where self-respect starts becoming visible. And the beautiful part is that this shift does not need to be performed. You do not have to announce it dramatically. You simply begin feeling less available for what used to pull you in. Your tolerance changes. Your appetite changes. The old pattern loses its emotional glamour because you can finally compare it to something better, your own steadiness. That comparison is hard for crumbs to survive, because once your inner life becomes calmer, you realize how loud that connection really was. Once your self-respect strengthens, you realize how often you were trying to call survival love. Once your standards return, the things you used to romanticize begin looking much smaller than they once did. That is not bitterness. That is clarity. And clarity is what raises standards in the healthiest way. It does not make you impossible to love. It makes you less willing to confuse instability with affection. It makes you less impressed by partial effort. It makes you more protective of the life you are rebuilding inside yourself. So this truth matters because it reminds you of something simple. The moment you come back to yourself, the connection is no longer the only thing deciding what feels normal. Peace gets a vote now. Dignity gets a vote now. Your future gets a vote now. And once that happens, what used to feel irresistible often starts feeling unworthy of your energy. Prepare for the withdrawal. The empty space is real. This part is important because letting go does not always feel empowering at first. Sometimes it feels quiet in a way that unsettles you. You stop reaching, you stop checking, you stop building your day around whether they appear, respond, soften, or give you one more sign to hold on to. And when all of that pulls back, there is suddenly space where emotional noise used to live. Space where the obsession used to run. Space where hope used to keep you occupied. That space can feel like loss. Not because you made the wrong choice, but because your system got used to the cycle. It got used to waiting, wondering, craving, anticipating. Even when the connection was hurting you, it was still giving your mind something constant to revolve around. So when you remove that pattern, your heart may not feel peace immediately. It may first feel withdrawal. That is normal. You are not only grieving a person, you are also grieving a rhythm, a habit, a false emotional structure that kept your attention busy and your hope alive. And when that disappears, the silence can feel heavier than you expected. The mind may try to convince you that the emptiness means you should go back. But the emptiness is not always a sign to return. Sometimes it is the first honest sign that something unhealthy has finally stopped feeding on your energy. That is why this stage needs patience. If you panic the moment the space appears, you will run back to the very thing that kept draining you simply because the familiarity feels easier than the rebuilding. But if you stay with the discomfort a little longer, something important begins happening inside that space. Your mind starts untangling. Your nervous system starts settling. Your life slowly starts having room for things that are not organized around emotional hunger. That is where rebuilding begins, not in the dramatic moment of letting go, but in what you do with the silence that follows. Do you fill it with more checking, more fantasy, more emotional relapse? Or do you begin using it to return to yourself, to your body, your routines, your friendships, your thinking, your own life? That choice matters because empty space is not the enemy. It is the room where your identity begins coming back together. It is where you learn what your days feel like when they are no longer ruled by that one connection. It is where you find out how much of your life had been waiting in the background while your attention kept circling the same person, the same hope, the same wound. And yes, some days it will hurt. Some days the silence will feel louder than it should. Some days your mind will romanticize what nearly broke you. Some days you will miss the intensity and mistake that longing for proof that the connection was right for you. Stay still when that happens. Longing is not always wisdom. Missing something is not always a sign to return to it. Sometimes it only means your heart is still adjusting to life without the pattern that used to consume it. That adjustment takes time, so this truth asks something gentle but strong from you. Do not be frightened by the empty space. Let it exist. Let it stretch out a little. Let it show you how much rebuilding is waiting there. Because what feels like loss at first may actually be the beginning of your life returning to you. You're not giving up on love, you're giving up on neediness. This is where the whole shift gets misunderstood. When you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop begging for warmth that should have come naturally, part of you may worry that you are becoming cold. You may even wonder if protecting your peace means closing your heart. But that is not what is happening at all. You are not giving up on love. You are giving up on the version of love that kept asking you to betray yourself in order to keep it alive. That is a very important difference. Neediness always creates distortion. It makes you hold on longer than you should. It makes weak effort look meaningful. It makes crumbs feel precious. It makes you read every tiny sign as if your whole future is hidden inside it. And once that happens, love stops being something you receive with clarity. It becomes something you chase with fear. That fear changes everything. It changes your tone, your timing, your standards. It makes you more available than you should be, more patient than is healthy, more willing to explain, excuse, and endure things that your clearer self would never call love. Not because your heart is foolish, but because neediness makes emotional hunger look like devotion. This is why clarity feels so different. When you start returning to yourself, you do not become less loving, you become less desperate. You stop asking another person to regulate your worth. You stop treating affection like oxygen. You stop building your emotional life around whether someone else is generous enough to give you the next sign that you matter. And once that need begins to loosen, your love becomes cleaner. You can still care deeply, but now you are not collapsing inside the care. You can still want closeness, but you are no longer willing to pay for it with your dignity. You can still hope for a real relationship, but you stop trying to force one out of confusion, inconsistency, and emotional starvation. That is not coldness. That is emotional sobriety. It is you finally seeing that stable love does not need you to beg, prove, chase, or keep shrinking yourself just to stay included. Stable love can breathe. It can be felt without all the panic. It can grow without turning your nervous system into a battlefield. And that is why clarity becomes attractive in the deepest sense. Not because you are playing hard to get, not because distance is a strategy, but because people can feel when someone is no longer emotionally leaking all over the connection. They can feel when your energy is steady, when your self-respect is intact, when your affection is real but not needy. That kind of presence feels different. It feels safe. It feels grounded. It feels mature. So this truth is worth holding on to when the old urge to chase starts speaking again. You are not turning away from love. You are turning away from the hunger that kept confusing instability with intimacy. You are not becoming unavailable. You are becoming clear enough to stop calling neediness love just because it was intense. And once that happens, something beautiful begins. You stop looking for someone to rescue your worth, and you start becoming the kind of person who can receive real affection without losing themselves inside it. Everything changes because you stop asking permission to matter. This is where the whole transformation becomes unmistakable. For a long time, the pain was not only in the relationship, it was in the way you kept waiting for someone else to confirm that your needs were valid, your heart was worthy, your presence was enough, and your standards were allowed to exist. Without realizing it, you kept placing your value in front of another person as if it needed their signature before it could become real. That is what begins to die here. The moment you stop asking permission to matter, your whole life starts rearranging itself. Your choices change first. You stop saying yes to things that leave you smaller. You stop chasing conversations that cost your dignity. You stop trying to earn tenderness from people who keep offering confusion. Something in you becomes quieter but stronger. Not because the longing vanished, but because your self-respect is no longer willing to kneel in order to be loved. That changes your confidence too. Not the loud kind, not the kind that performs strength. I mean the deeper kind, the one that comes from no longer needing to beg for emotional oxygen. You begin walking differently through your own life. You stop feeling like your worth is waiting somewhere outside you, hidden in someone else's consistency, someone else's affection, or someone else's decision to stay. Now your value stays with you, and once that happens, relationships start changing around you as well. You become less available for half-love, less impressed by attention that has no depth behind it, less willing to build your future on potential that keeps asking you to ignore reality. That does not make you difficult to love. It makes you harder to misuse. That is a good thing, because when your value is no longer up for negotiation, your energy stops sending mixed messages. You stop saying, "I deserve more," while accepting less. You stop talking about peace while participating in things that destroy it. Your life begins to match your truth more closely, and that kind of alignment has force in it. People feel it. They feel when you are no longer emotionally begging under the surface. They feel when your warmth is still there, but your neediness is gone. They feel when your standards are no longer decorative words, but lived reality. That is what makes this shift so powerful. It is not just internal. It changes the atmosphere around you. And the most beautiful part is this. Once you stop asking permission to matter, love itself starts looking different. You no longer chase it from panic. You no longer confuse being chosen with being made valuable. You no longer keep trying to prove that your heart is worth handling gently. You already know it is. That knowledge changes everything. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you pursue. It changes what you call love. It changes the kind of life you are finally willing to build. Because in the end, the real turning point was never only about them. It was about you deciding that your worth would no longer sit in someone else's hands. So, this is what really changes when you stop begging for affection. It is not only the relationship, it is you. Your mind gets clearer because it is no longer spending all day trying to decode mixed signals. Your heart gets quieter because it is no longer living on tiny emotional scraps and calling that hope. Your self-respect starts coming back because little by little you stop making private compromises just to keep someone close. And that shift reaches into everything. The way you text changes. The way you wait changes. The way you read silence changes. The way you see yourself changes. You stop treating another person's inconsistency like a mystery you must solve. You stop turning your needs into speeches. You stop translating your pain into softer language just so it will be easier for someone else to hear. You begin seeing what is there, not what you keep hoping is there. That is where peace begins returning. Not because love stops mattering, not because your heart becomes cold, but because you finally stop placing your worth inside somebody else's hands. And once that happens, your standards rise naturally. You become less available for confusion, less impressed by crumbs, less willing to call emotional instability romance. The same things that once kept you hooked begin looking smaller, louder, and far less beautiful than they did before. That is growth. You are not giving up on love. You are giving up on the version of love that kept asking you to abandon yourself. And that is why everything changes. Because when your value is no longer up for negotiation, your whole life starts moving differently. Your choices become cleaner. Your confidence becomes steadier. Your boundaries become real. Your relationships begin reflecting what you now believe about yourself. So if your heart has been tired, let this be the turn. Stop begging. Stop proving. Stop explaining what should not need that much explanation. Come back to yourself. Let behavior speak. Let silence reveal. Let your dignity become louder than your fear of losing them. Because the moment you stop asking permission to matter is the moment your life begins to feel like it belongs to you again.